All right, it's my privilege to present today's neuroprosthesis seminar speaker, Dr. Riki Banerjee. Riki is the Chief Technology Officer at Synchron. Most of you maybe are familiar, but Synchron is a clinical stage neurotechnology company that is in the process of commercializing an implantable brain-computer interface. Riki's an electrical engineer by training, completing her bachelor's at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and then her master's and PhD degrees at the University of Minnesota. Riki started her career in industry, working as an engineer on RF and wireless communication at 3M and later at Medtronic, and then grew into much larger leadership roles. Riki is definitely one of the leaders that I've had an opportunity to work with that I have the most respect for. Her teams really have been recognized for applying kind of first principles from physics and engineering to solve problems that expand patient access and have had really big impacts on, I would say, neuromodulation as a field. In addition to all those great contributions, kind of like what Riki and her teams have done, I've had a lot of admiration for how Riki goes about doing her job. Riki's someone who builds up the people around her, develops people, helps others grow their careers, and that's something I've kind of drawn a lot of inspiration from in terms of becoming a sponsor in my own right and hopefully creating opportunities for others. If you joined us in the spring, we heard a little bit from Dr. Doug Weber at one of the seminars about some of their collaborations in Pittsburgh with Synchron, and hopefully today we'll be able to hear some of Riki's insights about Synchron's perspectives on its translational journey. So with that, please join me in welcoming Riki to the stage.
So I joined Synchron about 3 years ago now, and I joined because I wanted to work. Well, it was first a world and this big clinical journey that we had to go on. I came up in Medtronic in R&D, had done a lot of product development and technology translation, but didn't see that Medtronic would take on this kind of a major clinical arc and journey. And so I'm excited that in 3 years I've learned what it means to do. I haven't completed my journey certainly, but I've learned a lot in terms of clinical translation in this space. So I'll try to take you through that. I obviously work at Synchron. I'm an employee and Stakeholder, and everything I'm going to talk about is investigational. All right, so let's talk about addressing an unmet clinical need and what that means with brain-computer interface. Okay, so there's over 5 million people in the US with paralysis, and this can be from many different conditions. And so you can kind of think about what we're thinking of as people who are having a deficit, in particular, in their motor function in their hands, and losing that ability to touch things the way that you or I might. And that can be attributed to many different conditions. So stroke, multiple sclerosis, neurodegenerative disorders, trauma, and neuromuscular. But as I talk about this, I think one of the things we've learned is as we're looking to make clinical meaningful benefit, it is helpful to think about the broader population that we can treat, but initially we may have to focus down so that we can find these people and find what their current clinical pathway is and how to approach them and work with them in our clinical trials. Implantable BCIs have been around for about 20 years. The early devices there's a lot of research going on here. I shouldn't even call them early devices. The Utah Array and BlackRock work is still ongoing, and it has been really foundational for research. The middle picture is showing Eddie Chang's work where he's been decoding speech, and he's doing that by understanding the neural function to create the motor motion of your mouth as you're speaking. So he's not even going to the speech center, he's going to the motor area and using that information to create decoding. And the state of the art, the headlines, the Nature publications, New England Journal of Medicine is a very amazing frontier. But what does translation mean as you're starting to think about many scientists working, and if I just go back up to that picture, you can see a scientist working with the patient, a rack of equipment, and so when you're doing research, you may use a lot of processing power. You may use a lot of specialized talent to help make the system operational. But if you're looking at at creating a system that can be used across a broad population, you really have to think about things differently. So Nick Ramsey and Nathan Crone wrote a paper in Nature and kind of identified 3 key areas to focus on. That the system needs to be fully implantable and a system that has that pedestal so that you can externalize the processing and powering of the system is a challenge in terms of being able to scale. Troubleshooting and the fact that you need scientists that are actively involved in the operation of the BCIs, and I mean that's just not something that you can deploy across like caregivers or even a base of clinicians such as like trained nurses and occupational therapists to support somebody with. And then stability, and stability is kind of interesting. Just in the last week, actually, since I'm trained from an engineering perspective, I think about all the layers of engineering that can contribute to instability. Like I think about biomaterials and degradation of materials, which I think is talked about here. But also I was just reading Nick Ramsey's publication that came out in August where he does an assessment of the patient with University of Utrecht and how she used the system for 7 years, but then didn't have utility of it after that point. And they try to do an assessment of why that utility degraded over time. And they're kind of trying to peel the layers of, all right, from an engineering side, how is the device working? Well, her condition is changing and her brain is physically changing, and so then what does that mean with respect to where the electrodes are? So especially as you're looking at neurodegenerative conditions, stability can mean different things. And literally last week I had like a little bit of an aha. Like my boss is Tom Oxley, he's an MD. Peter Yu, a lot of you might know, he's a neuroscientist, and I'm an engineer. And sometimes we're saying the same words, but we're not saying the same thing, and we're thinking about that very differently. So many of you may be familiar with this work with Mariska van Stiesel out of Nick Ramsey's group. This was the first fully implantable BCI. At my career at Medtronic, I had the opportunity to work for Tim Dennison. He doesn't like it when I say that. He's like, work with. And I'm like, no, I want everyone to know you're the leader, and I kind of trained under you. And I had the pleasure of being on his staff and learning a lot from that time. And he was at Medtronic, so the system and the device in the chest and then its cortical leads are placed enabled this study. And it's very inspirational because it's the first fully implanted system. And they talk about, through this 2016 article, the benefits that she got. Like a lot of people are like, well, there are non-invasive things. If somebody's verbal, they can use voice activation, or why can't they use eye tracking? Well, in a neurodegenerative condition, she's losing that ability, as well as, she wants to go outside, and she can't use an eye tracking system with going outside. So that was a very seminal article in this space, and she was using the system for 7 years, and then if you read the recent publication, at that point then her usage of the system deteriorated, and there was less confidence in her ability to control. Was she really controlling that system, or were these artifacts that were happening? Okay, so what is clinical meaningfulness? So for BCI to provide meaningful benefit in the real world, it must allow for user autonomy and continuous functionality. And at the conference in Brussels in 2023, Nick Ramsey kind of laid out 5 things that have been really beneficial to think about as we're thinking about clinical meaningfulness. So the system shall have stable use, but I just kind of described how stability can mean different things, right? So it should be always available when the person wants to use it. It should have immediate use, so you don't want to have 40 training sessions with a patient for them to get up to use it with specialized personnel. Easy to learn. And then ease of use, so low recalibration after a patient's using it. And this has been a nice framework, but this came about in 2023. So already at this point, I joined Synchron in 2021. It was a lot of thinking about like what's going to be meaningful here. What is BCI? How do we distill this in a way such that we can get to a pivotal trial and make measurements? So I'll pivot a little bit just to make sure we're all grounded as to what technology I'm working on and with. Some of you are familiar, and so the Stentrode is a stent-like device with electrodes. little video here showing, so it's a stent-like device with electrodes, and then there's a lead body. It's situated in the blood vessel at the top of the head. And that area is interesting. That kind of glowing area is where your motor cortex and sensory cortex are, and so that's an interesting spot. It's a large blood vessel that's right in that location, and so you can get rich motor information from that location. And then the lead body is coming down that blood vessel. It goes down the back of your head and kind of curves, and then it comes out actually on two sides through your jugular veins. So the way that it's implanted is a jugular puncture is done, and then a catheter is wound up to deploy that device in that location. And then I think, one of the interesting aspects has been stability, this kind of stability. So neural tissue can have a reaction to a foreign body being placed, and that's been seen in deep brain stimulation, also the Neuralink device. There are different aspects of the brain. So the brain is moving, just slightly moving, unless you have a concussive event, of course. But also there's a healing reaction and tissue reaction going on, and that can erode the performance and change the performance of your electrodes. So one of the things that's beneficial for the Synchron devices, we're sitting in the blood vessel, so we're not actually contacting the neural tissue. And then what happens in a blood vessel is the tissue endothelializes over time, which actually from an electrical engineering perspective gives you a fairly stable environment for that device to be seated in. And then I mentioned this already, but the kind of interesting area from a neuroscientist standpoint is that if you put it in the right place, you're getting rich sensory and motor information, and the yellow is showing kind of the electrodes and how they would be displayed. So what is clinical translation? How do we define that? And actually it's been really fun and exciting as I've been meeting different people here at CASE. You guys have really amazing people and faculty that have come to support innovation here. And Bob was sharing these culture grants and these mechanisms that you guys have, and sharing how much engagement there is with those programs. I've enjoyed hearing some of the same language I use in terms of translation and the different things that you have to think about. So you're grounded in some really good practices. You first start out on the bench or preclinical work, maybe animal models, maybe computational models, and you're kind of asking those early questions of, can we invent a solution to a health problem? And then you start your first foray into, could this invention work in humans? And one of the challenges in this space is a lot of times it's really hard to get true voice of customer, a voice of patient until you've started doing your implants. And so there's like a chicken or the egg problem where it's like, all right, how do I learn as much as I can preclinically? And then how do I be really actionable about the questions I'm going to ask and how I'm going to understand while working with patients and make the best use of that time. And then as you mature in your journey, you're looking at scalability. Does this benefit a patient population? What is that patient population? And then can it be delivered reliably into practice, and does it improve public health overall? I'll kind of draw some lines here that this is your first phase to PMA approval and a second phase to reimbursement. So often in this space, if you benchmark companies that have been successful, they kind of take it in those two stages. The CEO of Dexcom, which is the first diabetic insulin infusion pump, continuous glucose monitoring, he very much had this journey, and I think even post PMA it was another 7 years before they got to reimbursement. So these journeys can take a lot of time and can be really long, but they're very innovative and interesting too. So what's the story of Synchron with respect to this kind of framework that I laid out? Well, Synchron started in 2010, 2012 timeframe, working in the preclinical space, bench work. There's stories of them approaching Medtronic around that 2010, 2012 timeframe, asking for those first stents. So they They got a patent, got some DARPA funding, they knocked on the door of Medtronic, and they were like, hey, can we have a few stents? And I think a lot of the people that I've talked to that were at those initial conversations were like, huh, well, these guys have a lot of energy. This idea seems kind of out there, but okay. And a lot of people took a chance on them. So they took those stents back to Australia, a lot of the work done at University of Melbourne, a very small team in the beginning, and they created those first Stentrodes that are shown in the picture on the bottom. I have a picture of the notebook from where Tom actually drew his first concept. He was studying to be a neurointerventionalist and working with people who had strokes and then really became locked in or had very severe paralysis due to a stroke, and he was looking for ways that he could create innovation to benefit them. And then in 2016, they demonstrated sensing in a large animal model through the blood vessel, and so that was a big seminal Nature publication at that point. The team then at that point experienced some growth, but still I would say 8 to 10 people, pretty much all in Australia. I think Tom at that point was doing his training at Mount Sinai in New York City. And they started embarking on that path to developing a device that could be implanted in people. With such a small team, they're working with external vendors and suppliers. We ended up with a company that we call it the recording head, but that stent end of the device is developed by a company in Germany, and they're a startup themselves. And they saw the Nature publication, and then they called Synchron in Australia, and they were like, hey, we can do this better. We can do this for you. So that was the start of their relationship there, somewhere around 2017, 2018, and developing that first Stentrode, working with some other suppliers. The device that's in the chest, you can kind of see it in the picture there, called the ITU. It doesn't have a battery, so it's powered externally, and that ETU has to be on it for communication and powering. But that was a modification of a device used for peripheral nerve stimulation. And so that company said, hey, I think I have something for you. I can modify this and do what you need to do. So lots of great ideas coming together. And your first thing, paramount, is safety. Absolutely baseline safety. So biomaterials, biocompatibility, making sure you have good mechanical performance, and that you can implant this device. Those are definitely the first tenets. And then you try to create a system where you have some openness where you can explore once that implant is in place. For patients in Australia, they had severe paralysis. Safety was the goal, but there's been a lot of work with the people in Australia. They have had significant contributions and a lot of learning. With the success of that, then started the early feasibility studies in the U.S. So they applied for FDA approval at that point for the first early feasibility study investigational device approval, and then also landed funding at that time. And around 2021 is when I joined. And so we grew from the 10 people, mostly in Australia. I think I was like 5th in the U.S. Now we're like 60, pretty much U.S. based. And then the endpoints there are safety, but then we had learned enough to also put in some secondary endpoints so that we could do more exploration of utility of the device. So, what does it mean to do translational research? And I mentioned this RAMSE-5 that I'm showing on the right and how that kind of came about in 2023, right? So here's some core tenets of things we want to explore and we want to understand. So can this system demonstrate the RAMSE-5, right? So from a clinical translation standpoint, we've created a system that has safety, that has some openness, so you can do research, but is this a translatable system that can take us along that long journey that I was talking about? So what is stability? So actually I might refine this slide after what I learned last week, I guess, but this was kind of my thinking, as I thought about it. And it is really like a technology stack kind of problem. If your manufacturing is unstable, if you are hand building these parts, there's a lot of variability in them. So one of the things in terms of when you place it, and I showed the motor cortex and the sensory cortex and how precisely can you place it and how precisely do you need to place it. those are things that we didn't maybe fully understand when we designed the product. And so as we've embarked on a journey of designing the next version, we can do that with a lot more precision and control. Mechanical design goes hand in hand with manufacturing, but then electrical design I kind of have built upon that. Because if your mechanical design and your manufacturing has a lot of variability, those of you that work in the sensing domain realize you'll get a lot of noise in your sensing data. And then what? Like, how do you extract that's from the layers of engineering versus that's the patient condition? Back to the question about stability. It's really hard to extract that information. So getting your design to be, and your manufacturing to be stable is really important. And then upon that is decoding. I know I've encountered a lot of people that are like, yep, you just put it in place and decoding filters. Like, it's just a signal processing thing. And I can see a lot of people shaking their heads, and we're working with really small neural signals. So all of those interfaces matter, and that was actually my journey at Medtronic. Like, Chris and I kind of lived that journey of even a stable product that was used for deep brain stimulation, how much we learned that when we tried to sense, that there were a lot of little places where cardiac noise could get in, or a lot of little places where, as we worked on devices like Percept PC and SenSight, we had the opportunity to really design for sensing at that point. So I'll just say, there have been challenges with that first system in terms of stability. You're taking a device that was intended for use for something else and then transforming it. Had baseline safety, but was it stable enough for this application? I think in general we've navigated it, we've been working with it, but I think there is opportunity to be had there for sure. So what is happening with people who have these conditions? So when in an able-bodied person, there's a lot of places in the pathway to getting to, using our devices and communicating using digital devices. So, it's going from your brain to your brainstem, spinal cord, and then eventually to your peripheral nerves and your muscles. And so lots of different conditions can inhibit those different pathways. And so what we're trying to do really is, kind of take that intent from the brain and translate it so that someone can use a device and communicate. They may not use the device in the same way that an able-bodied person does, but we're trying to map with an ecosystem of accessibility tools and innovation that's going on in the tech space to enable an appropriate interaction for someone that has some challenges. So we call that the digital motor output, kind of with the idea that the primary goal in what we're doing is trying to enable someone to interact with a digital ecosystem. And what is clinical meaningful use of a digital motor output? You might be like, well, that's cool that you can play games and stuff, but is that really clinically meaningful? And so we've been borrowing upon a framework of occupational therapy. And that's where, if you've worked with occupational therapy, they're looking at these instrumental activities of daily living as a measure of autonomy. So can you manage your own finances? Can you communicate and manage your own health? Can you interact with your environment? Can you communicate? So these things that are listed on here are some of those instrumental activities of daily living. And so our clinical meaningfulness is to show an improvement that someone is able to manage some of those things on their own. And then this is kind of, again, saying if we can interface with accessibility tools, large language models of ChatGPT, then we can create compelling user interfaces and create a system that has more quick communication. This is one of our patients in the command trial. He has ALS and he has pretty limited capability, just a little residual cheek movement. He had one finger where they would kind of strap his hand to a doorbell, and then he's kind of using this framework to communicate his pain score. This one is showing similarly, how can you use these types of interaction models in tandem with the BCI so that someone can manage their finances. This is integration with the large language model, such as ChatGPT, to improve communication and speed of communication. And then in this one, this is one of our patients from the command trial, and he's actually able to kind of create a continuous motion of that paddle and control that paddle location so that he can play the game.
Many electrodes does it have?
So the system has 16, but I mentioned some 16.
16.
Mm-hmm. But I mentioned some of the challenges we had with stability in manufacturing. So patients didn't always get a full 16 of functionality. So that was kind of some of the challenges, is like, all right, how do we figure out how, what function is there and clear, and work with them to get utility. And so I think that's something, as we improve the stability of our product, we can I think there's opportunity there to improve the type quality of signal and what we can do with it. So I think, to answer the question of does that system get us to fully through clinical translation, I think the answer is no. Like, we were able to demonstrate some of those attributes of Ramsey 5. We were able to learn and do research, but that's not a product that gets you to PMA and to full scalability. And so I think, as you develop a neurotech product, like, that's, I think, I use the word research system versus like a product, and people are like, what do you mean? And that's kind of what I mean, is like, early on when you're doing that, the early learnings and really trying to get those first inputs. I think Ian's in the audience and he leads the BCI Pioneers. I mean, that's the pioneer, right? They're the first ones that are helping us understand, like, how will a person interact with this? How will they use it? And then those inputs funnel into being a key stakeholder, and understanding their journey through the healthcare system and their interaction with these types of devices. So a product has to consider all the stakeholders. It has to provide the stability in the hardware. You can't be kind of tweaking it all the time and working around it, because then you'll always have to have scientists like tweaking it in. And then I mentioned ensure change agility in the software. So, one of the challenges is in a regulated space, anytime you make a change to a product is often like a submission. And so navigating that and understanding the different tools of regulatory pathway, and how in this space where you're going to be changing and adapting, that you can work with the regulators to create an appropriate framework for doing that. And then enabling that translational research and commercialization. So the early feasibility study pathway has been really useful for that. Do you have a question?
Prior to it being installed?
By longest, like, I think we have a patient that's more than 4 years with this implant. And that particular person their condition is actually, reasonably stable. And so I don't think they've had a lot of change in their utility, outside of the fact that we've been getting better at the system and they've gotten improvements.
I mean, like, how long were they paralyzed before having?
I don't think I know that, in that particular case. We've had other patients in the study, though, that have kind of, especially with ALS patients, they can have a pretty progressive disease state. And so I think an ability. I think the Nick Ramsey recent publication is a helpful like kind of standard for like thinking about that, and how do you think about the patient condition versus the device and their change in utility. Yeah, so kind of what I'm showing here though is like like your user-centered design is with the patient always in mind, but it's an ecosystem. They have caregivers, they might have professional caregivers, they might have family members that are caring for them. There's the device design and standards, there's regulations, there's reimbursement. There's different kinds of physicians. There might be an implanting physician, there might be physicians or clinicians that are working with these people. So understanding that ecosystem and all those partners. These pictures on the bottom are frankly a little bit of my journey coming into Synchron. So I joined Synchron 3 years ago, and really the first thing I worked on, this isn't something any of you probably even think about, but supply chain stability. When you work on chronic implants, you're going to be with those partners that build your product or manufacture your product for 10 plus years. So kind of coming into Synchron, I looked at the various partners we were working with, and you need really good transparency. You need people who are on the same page as you about what you're trying to do, and if there's a problem, that you have good trust that they will be transparent and communicate clearly and quickly with you. As the entity that's trying to commercialize it, Synchron is the one that owns all of that responsibility, but in owning that responsibility, you need to ensure that your management team is trained, your partners have the right training and the right ethos of doing things, and know the practices of doing things. So right away when I came into Synchron, I kind of evaluated the different partners we had, and we made some changes at that time, and made sure that we had kind of a good foundation for where we were going. Quality system. So I think most of you are aware that in this space this is a big deal. Some of you have probably worked in a quality system, but we were in the first days of developing that and developing our tools for working in a quality system. If some of you had lunch with me, and I was talking about how at a big company, people were always dancing and knew a certain way of doing things, and then you as a new employee get absorbed into that dance. At a startup, you're always creating that dance, and I'll call the quality system basically a dance, like quality and regulatory. There's a way of doing things, a language, and bringing people into the fold and helping them understand the importance of that and how you do things and why. And then using that framework to develop the product and kind of taking it through stages. Like our first design inputs were like, boy, how do we even start creating requirements for this product and understanding it? And a process of understanding, you're always breaking up the problem and then piecing it back together. So early days of requirements, you might be like, well, I know this is important, but I'm just going to say TBD right now, to be determined. And then I'm going to do this study. And that study is going to, or I'm going to create this little prototype, or I'm going to do a little paper exercise, or I'm going to go look at the literature. I'm going to find information, and then I'm going to say, all right, this is kind of where I think we should be. And then a process of refinement from there and iterativeness. So creating that mechanism for Synchron, and then translational research. And so that's the understanding of, you're not just going to create a product, even if you did your best to get lots of voice of customers. This is a chronic implant, and so it's a process of learning over time with partners, with physicians, with clinicians, with the patients, with the caregivers and families, and through an implant, you have to do that through implant. So the early feasibility framework from the FDA is really about that translational research framework. And the people that like to live in a land of ambiguity and things where things are messy and then bring order to them are maybe different than the people who like things when they're a little more orderly and you kind of know what to do and you know how to execute. I think I shared that with Chris this morning on our drive over, that recognizing those different talents of people and having the right people at the right time and making sure that you're building over time and progressing over time. So that's kind of where we're going to get to a pivotal study. You really walk that journey of that ambiguity and undefined and TBDs and not dancing to dancing until things are much more clear. And then when things are more clear, you can go into that pivotal study and execute on that study to get that pre-market approval. So that's kind of been my journey at Synchron, and we're working on this clinical translation. We're still in the early feasibility studies, but it's been a pretty rewarding experience.
Is there a difference in approach depending on like the cause of paralysis, say like spinal cord damage versus stroke? Because I know in stroke patients there tends to be a decent amount of reorganization in the cortex. So how do you account for that when you're finding methods?
Yeah, I think. Oh, yeah, sure. So I think he was asking about, is there a difference in approach in terms of different conditions? So I specifically mentioned people who are in stroke, who have a lot of reorganization, versus, well, it was a spinal cord injury, I think, yeah. So I think that's been a learning over time. I think when I started at Synchron, Tom initially was like, well, there are a lot of things, like that story I told, I think comes from those days of like, there are a lot of things that can cause that functional challenge. But to your point, their conditions might be varying, but also how they're being cared for in the healthcare system might be quite variable. So I think those multiple things have kind of come into play is like, hey, we need to maybe focus our where we're looking for these patients, and focus our efforts, I guess I'll say, on how we're looking for these patients and engaging with that community, frankly. So I think we're a little more focused towards neurodegenerative disorders right now. I think with that thought in mind, that will be more successful if we kind of take this step by step. And then I think to your point, so it's again that like break up the problem, solve a portion of it, bring it back together. Yeah.
Let's thank Riki
Oh.
for her lecture. Maybe we can try to use the.
I'm curious about the hardware stability problem. How much does that affect the product schedule / cost and patient experience?
Should I use this? I think I have to use this one. Yeah, so, I think that for any neurotech, like, active implantable neurotech, they're going to kind of face this question. So I benchmarked a lot, like Inspire Medical, for example, and they built on a framework of a product from Medtronic. They came out of Medtronic. So Inspire Medical is a obstructive sleep apnea implant. So it's a neurostimulator, and it stimulates the hypoglossal nerve. And they were able to build upon this Medtronic platform, and the benefit of that is they had a pretty small, bare bones engineering team, and really they were learning a lot through this process and able to kind of build on a framework of a product that was developed using strong med tech practices, of course, at Medtronic, and so. They were able to do that, but I think as I've come out of Medtronic and I see this ecosystem, I talked to the team working on Cosmic, for example, or there are that's an open source idea. There's other companies that are providing systems. I think that has to be thought about, because then those systems become chronic implants, and how do you support that patient for 10 plus years, like I was saying? Like, what does your supply chain look like for that? But I think the question is asking about, what does that do for cost and stuff, right? So at Synchron, this has been the journey, and it was known by Tom and the board that we needed to develop something different, and so that's what he fundraised for. So does it cost more? Yeah, it does cost more. But he knew that, and that was part of what he fundraised for, and that's also why he hired someone like me that knows how to do that, right? So you have to make the journey that's right for you, get to the endpoints that give you the value and show those proof principles so that you can continue to get funding. And there are different ways to do that.
So you mentioned that the Stentrode has 16 electrodes, and I'm curious to know what aspects of the design or technology are responsible for there being 16. Like, what would have to happen for there to be even more, assuming more is better for decoding?
Yeah, so I think the other thing in this space is there's so many different things to take on, like where do you find your patients? How is your patient's condition changing? To understanding and inventing all of the technology. So Neuralink took it all on, but their budget is more than $400 million before they got to their first patient. So if you have those kinds of resources, then I guess that's a good way to go. But most companies don't have those kinds of resources. So you build upon things that are existing. So where does 16 come from? It comes from using technologies that are proven safe and existing, so that you don't have to invent everything. The recording at itself is new and novel. And you could do more than 16. That's a thin film printed thing on a wafer. You could do more than 16 there. But then to take those electrodes, connect them into wires, then bring the wires down into the device is kind of then we're building on a framework that exists. There are technologies and methodologies out there for getting that kind of thing to more. They're more at the front edge. I mean, I think everyone kind of thinks that the device in the chest with the ports is a pretty old school way of building things. That kind of technology has been around for a long time, and so now there are ways of developing things through wafer scale packaging. For neurotech in particular, the idea of that device being somehow like cranial mount, so you're not trying to traverse things through the neck, is a compelling idea. So there are that ecosystem is being seeded, and I think a lot of people are taking that front forward. So I think one of the things that's a positive of someone like a Neuralink is it does push that envelope forward. If you do have the resources and you do really push into that, then that does move the industry forward, I think, in a positive way.
How limited are you to areas that are directly along the superior sagittal sinus, and do you have plans to expand that? And because of that limitation currently, how does that make you competitive with other technologies like the microelectrode arrays or Neuralink's technology?
Yeah, currently we're focused on that space. You can develop neural interfaces for other blood vessels, or we could, and I think we've talked to physicians about access to some of those, and there are some other compelling areas that, in particular, that motor and sensory area are kind of coming down, and so there are some interesting blood vessels that could give us interesting access. But we'll definitely start with the superior sagittal sinus. I mean, I think what we're doing is quite different than what Neuralink is doing. And so what you see in that kind of device is a lot of electrodes, but in a really concentrated space, trying to get those single action potential information. And so they have a lot of redundancy. As they've had issues, they're basically kind of almost extrapolating to an LFP style decoding. But now they're only in a really, really, really small area. And so how much redundancy of how much uniqueness of the information are you getting at that point? So one of the benefits of what we're doing is our electrodes are quite a bit spread out, and we're doing modeling and understanding how many features can you extract from that space.
I actually had a question kind of similar to that, but there was a second part to my question, which is kind of having the electrode in that central position where you have access to maybe both hemispheres and motor and sensory. Has there been work, or what work has been done to see the separability of the signals? Could you decode separate information from left and right, from motor, from sensory? Is that a direction in the future?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty excited about the future. I think for that exact reason. And I think that's been one of the confluences of the challenges of, our pretty unique manufacturing where it was kind of done by hand. We're moving in our manufacturing facility towards robotics and towards things that are much more consistent and predictable. And I think that will enable us to improve our signal to noise, which then should enable us to see more. There's things like that that we're able to understand in this current generation that we're improving exactly for those benefits.
Hi, I had a question more on the design process. How do you go about balancing having a minimal viable product but also a stable hardware? Especially as an engineer, I keep feeling like we try to move towards perfection, but we also want to get a product going.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's so I've been as I've been meeting with different people, I think that the process in industry is so I was kind of remarking on the difference sometimes between what I see in academia versus in industry. And sometimes in academia you're trying to get to the next paper and then open more questions so that you can get more research and more funding and more students. And the process in industry is you kind of have to figure out what's good enough. And I think there are good mechanisms and processes for understanding hazards and patient safety risk and having a conversation through a framework that's like, okay, well, what will this impact? And so is it good enough or no, this is going to impact a safety outcome and we need to really fix this, right? So those are kind of things in the design process that you're always trying to balance as you make decisions, and then you're trying to kind of close down those scoping decisions over time to get to an outcome.
So I kind of have a question. So this is almost entirely based on recording and decoding of intention, and obviously the other big question when it comes to BCI is the stimulation. So I'm wondering, with the device being intravascular, is it even possible, or would it affect blood flow, something else? Is it possible to stimulate?
Yeah, that's a great question for a research institution. So there is a Synchron publication in 2018 showing STIM. I think actually there's a recent one. So Medtronic has a very recent publication. So there's been some really good recent publications. I think there's another one out of Australia that's pretty recent. Demonstrating that you can stimulate from a blood vessel, you can activate different regions, those kinds of things. But I think the foundational research question in my mind is, what are the effects of chronic stim? And so, I think in the cardiovascular space, there's chronic stim in the blood vessels, but I think that every blood vessel you choose has its own autonomic function. And one of the things I learned coming into Synchron, a lot of the endovascular work is on the arterial side, and we're one of the first devices on the venous side, and there are different structures. So even just from imaging and understanding what's in there and why are those structures there, and they were placing the first Stentrode in the venous side, and no one had done this before. People didn't really place stents on that side, I guess. And there were these kind of lumpy, they're called, I think, arachnoid granulations. There were these little lumpy structures. And they were like, what's going to happen? Is the stent going to be bendy around that structure? But it's a soft tissue structure. And so as they put the stent down, the arachnoid granulation kind of receded and then bloomed back out through the stent-like structure. So it was fine. But, these are the kinds of things that are foundational research questions that I think would need to be studied to enable endovascular stim.
My question is more on the topic of product development and commercialization, but throughout all of this long process of clinical translation, do you guys have sort of a North Star, a very clear vision of a product you want to build, or is the approach more just keep innovating until you hit a new frontier? What's sort of the framework that you guys keep in mind for that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I think there are a lot, I kind of mentioned kind of that comfort and the ambiguity kind of thing. And I think there can be a lot of we're building this product. And I've learned the language of we're going to have some concepts. And I think there is an aspect of keeping things open, keeping that TBD, like, yes, I need that requirement, so I'm going to put a placeholder in, but I'm not going to assign the exact value. And then I'm going to do a little study, and that's going to inform it. And then I'm going to have the more mature product, and that's going to inform it. And I'm going to keep iterating until I kind of hone in, and recognizing that the path. I think our board member, who's the CEO, former CEO of Dexcom, was like, in hindsight, the path always looks straight, but really you were just like all the time, and you're always problem solving. So I might start out by saying, I'm going to build that device, and I'm going to test electrical function, mechanical function, and biocompatibility all on that device, and then it's like, well, I can't get you batteries. The battery supply chain is 20 weeks out. And so part of it is that you get really good at putting the pieces of the puzzle together differently. It's like, okay, I'm not gonna get batteries, so what can I do with the circuit board and power supply? And oh yeah, okay, I can learn these 3 things from that, and then I can put the pieces of the puzzle together this way, and I can go do some mechanical tests, and I can learn those pieces of the puzzle. And then later, we've learned all this stuff, and 20 weeks has happened, and I get the battery, and now I put it together. And it's the same thing through clinical translation. We're gonna ask some key questions, and then we're gonna, walk that journey and just learn to change and adjust.